The issue of the day is realism. First, let's set the scene. What was happening during that time and how did realism come about? Any takers? Yes, you in the front there with the unibrow.
Realism began in 1865 and lasted up until around 1910. During that time, the Civil War had just ended and people had moved on from the Romantic way of thinking. Instead of their central focus being on religion and perfection, people took it upon themselves to look at the situation realistically. They saw each other as simply a person.
Mr. Doctor Professor, do you know what realism is? Yes, realism was an artistic movement that attempted to depict everyday life in its purest form.
Can you add anything else to that?
I shall take a stab at it. Realist authors opted for depictions of everyday life and banal activities instead of a romanticized presentation.
The Civil War had an impact on the arrival of realism. The Civil War was fought from 1861 to 1865 between the northern states and several southern slave states that had declared their secession and formed the Confederate States of America. The war had its origin in the issue of slavery, and after 4 years of bloody combat, mostly in the South, the Confederacy was defeated, slavery was abolished, and the difficult Reconstruction process of restoring unity and guaranteeing rights to freed slaves began.
After the Civil War, people were hardened because the country was falling apart and their friends and family were dying. Some effects of the Civil War were families became divided, soldiers had a hard life, and freedmen were not treated with respect or equality. Therefore, the romantic ideals, which had an emphasis on the imagination and emotions, an appreciation of external nature, and an interest in the remote, were discarded and realism came into light.
Here is a chart to help explain the transformation from Romanticism to realism in literature. For Romanticism, characters may be larger than life, and in realism, characters resemble ordinary people, like Ichabod Crane and Huck Finn. The plot contains unusual events, mystery, or high adventure, like Edgar Allan Poe's stories, but in realism, the plot is developed with ordinary events and circumstances. In Romanticism, the ending is often happy, like how Hester discovers who she is and how she wants to be, and she ends up with the guy. And in realism, the ending might be unhappy, like how Huck Finn still feels ashamed that he helped a slave run away, and he goes west. Okay. In Romanticism, the language is often like formal, and in Huck Finn, the language was like very informal. And then for Romanticism, settings often are made up, and in Huck Finn, for realism, the setting actually exists, and a writer is interested in history or legend, and in realism, the writer is interested in recent or contemporary life. Yes, the end. Quick question. How does realism affect art?
Realism in art is often defined as the representation of subject matter as it is without fantasizing it. Before the introduction of realism, which occurred in France in the 1850s, the exaggerated view of the Romanticism movement was still present. During the time of realism, people used photography because it captured a scene exactly the way it was. This was different from other media during the time. Realist painters depicted the simplicity of a subject from everyday life. They did not look to dramatize or idolize it. Today, realism represents forms and materials that are simply themselves.
Wow, that's so interesting.
I know. Now here's an art analysis by Melissa.
Realism had effect on the art, and by looking at these two pictures, you can tell the differences between the movement of realism and the movement of romanticism. In the picture on the left, which is depicting realism, it shows a common girl in an everyday situation, whereas the picture on the right, which represents romanticism, it represents the romantic ideal. The main focus is on an angel and the ideas of that time, which are most commonly referred to as manifest destiny. And at that time in U.S. history, there was Western expansion. And at that time, people had the idea that moving west would bring them fame and fortune. This was very fantasized compared to the ideals of realism, which consisted of everyday life, everyday people, and everyday situations.
How is realism still being used in the world today?
People can still apply the philosophy of realism to their everyday lives by looking at a situation for what it is.
What came after realism?
Impressionism, which is a literary or artistic style that depicts a scene or character that tries to capture a feeling of emotion or experience.
What would you say society is today?
Modernism, an artistic or literary philosophy that accommodates traditional teachings and past ways of thinking to contemporary thought. And neoclassicism, which is the revival of classical art, literature, architecture, music, or way of thinking.
A deer, a female deer, ray, a drop of golden sun. Me, a name I call myself, far, a long, long way to run. So, a needle pulling thread, la, a note to follow, so. Tea, a drink with jam and bread, that will bring us back to dough. Oh, 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 dough! A deer, a female deer, ray, a drop of golden sun. Me, a name I call myself, far, a long, long way to run. So, a needle pulling thread.